We check in on the latest avalanche conditions with the Colorado Avalanche Information Center for an update. Joining us this morning on Mountain Mornings is Brian Lazar, the Deputy Director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Good morning, Brian.
Morning, Callie. Thanks for having me.
So what are the current avalanche conditions now that we're getting into springtime weather?
Yeah, we are getting into springtime weather. This means our snowpack's going through a bit of a transition. So it's transitioning from kind of a cold, dry, winter-like snowpack into a more mature spring snowpack. And when it's fully ripe and mature, we've got, water well drained through the snowpack. But while we're in this transition period, we tend to have a variety of avalanches that we might encounter into the backcountry. And it very well describes the kind of current situation. And so if you look at our homepage map here, you can see that most of the state is sitting at moderate avalanche danger, or level 2 out of 5, with the Grand Mesa sitting at low avalanche danger. And if I click on the Front Range, just as an example, conditions are fairly similar throughout the state. And what we saw starting kind of with our big warm up at the end of last week and into last weekend was a lot of wet avalanche activity because of the snap to very warm spring-like temperatures. And last night, which was on Tuesday night, we got our first kind of really solid freeze. And so that's alleviated the wet avalanche concerns for most of the day today. So you can see that we've got low danger at the higher elevations, and that's simply because that freeze is likely to hold up all day long. But the temperatures alone might get us to the point where we break down surface freezes, let's say after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we could see wet avalanche activity again. With slightly warmer temperatures forecast for tomorrow, you can see that those conditions creep up in elevation to this near tree line elevation band. And so when we talk about wet avalanche activity, it really does come in a couple flavors here. You can see we've got loose wet avalanche activity, which is just cohesionless snow. And I'll show some examples of these kinds of things. And then we've got wet slab avalanche activity, which are cohesive pieces of snow, but they're still being triggered by water infiltrating the snowpack and weakening underlying weak layers. You can see here we've got our avalanche distribution rows, and the gray shaded areas show where you're most likely to encounter this type of avalanche. And you can see here we've got this outer ring shaded, which indicates you can see here the below tree line elevation band. The middle here is the above tree line elevation band, and then that middle ring is near tree line. So because it's colder up high, we're not expecting wet avalanche activity at the higher elevations, but we might see it late in the day at these lower elevations below tree line. And then lastly, if we scroll down to our kind of third avalanche problem, and this is very characteristic of a transitional snowpack where we've got a variety of avalanche types that we're dealing with. On these high elevation north facing shady colder slopes, we still have a dry, more winter-like snowpack. And on these particular slopes, we can still trigger hard slabs that are resting on weak layers near the ground. You're most likely to trigger these types of avalanches in thinner snowpack areas with less than about 4 feet of snow on the ground. So if I show you, here's an example of our forecaster who went out yesterday out near Aspen, but it's a really good, he's got some good pictures of the kinds of avalanches that we're talking about. So here's an example of some loose, wet avalanches coming out of steep, rocky terrain, which is very common in the spring. But you can see if you were caught down here, this does pile up enough debris to bury or injure a person. In this same area yesterday, if we scroll here, is a really good example of a wet slab avalanche. And this particular photo is really good because it starts up high with this loose wet avalanche, which ran a short distance and then triggered the slab, or this cohesive piece of snow. And it's running on weak layers that have water in them. And so these are wet slabs. And this is by far the most prevalent kind of avalanche we've been dealing with over about the last week, just because of all the meltwater infiltration into the snowpack. And these are the most common kinds of avalanches that we're going to see throughout the rest of this week and into the upcoming weekend. We do have less activity, but we're still seeing some of these kind of drier, persistent slab avalanches. And this is an example from near the Aspen zone from just last week. But you can see we're dealing with dry slabs of snow running on the weak layers near the ground. And again, this is perfect illustration of the kind of terrain where you would expect these steep and fairly shallow with a lot of intermittent snow cover and rocks and trigger points poking through the snowpack. So this is going to be our condition for, the next week or two. Eventually, with continued prolonged warm temperatures, water will find its way to the bottom of the snowpack and eventually drain, and then we'll have a ripe and mature spring snowpack, which becomes a lot more predictable and easy to manage. But until we get there, we have to be cognizant of these weak layers, particularly the dry ones near the ground, because they tend to wake up and produce avalanches when they see meltwater for the first time.
Yeah, spring-like conditions coming our way as things get warmer and warmer. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for the update today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Again, check out the current avalanche risk directly on the CAIC website, www.colorado.gov/avalanche.